good morning, everyone. I'm Isabel Wadsworth, and today I will be presenting an analytical investigation regarding the autobiographical elements in Kafka's The Metamorphosis. The title of my analysis is Kafka's Mirror, and I will be presenting my analysis in 3 parts, similarly to the structure of the novel. So my topic of focus, like I mentioned, is autobiographical elements, specifically addressing Kafka's inspiration for writing the novella, drawing parallels between Franz Kafka and the protagonist he created, Gregor Samsa, and lastly, discussing autobiographical themes, so themes that correlate in Kafka's life and in the novel The Metamorphosis. My thesis specifically states that analytically investigating evidence of autobiographical elements in Kafka's The Metamorphosis allows readers to better comprehend the existentialist novel by drawing comparisons between the author and his work. So let's move on to part 1. I wanted to introduce the novel so you understand his inspiration and motive, because it's a common misconception. So Kafka began writing The Metamorphosis on the evening of November 17, 1912. He had 3 sisters, and of these 3, he was most fond of Attila, who was the youngest. After looking at diaries and excerpts from his biographies, I found that him and Attila often corresponded while traveling, and Attila supported him in his endeavors more than any other family member did in his family. And on the evening of November 17, 1912, his family was sitting down and having a discussion, and Attila eventually sided with the rest of the family in regards to Franz's career choice. So on that evening, they were discussing who was going to cover for Kafka's brother-in-law, because he was away on business for 14 days. And Kafka was up for grabs because he has a law degree, he's well-informed and well-educated. Attila spoke out when she usually didn't, and she supported her father. And Kafka didn't want to do this because he was in the middle of writing a book, and he did not want to drop everything to address family business, even though it was crucial because they were in a financial crisis. His family was very business-oriented. They were in the factory business, and most of the members were involved. Despite this, Kafka disagreed to embark on that situation, and he was crushed by this. And I can prove it by reading you a diary entry that turned into a letter to his best friend and eventually biographer Max Brod. And it says, "I realized clearly that there were only 2 options for me, either to jump out the window after everyone had gone to bed, or go to the factory and my brother-in-law's office on a daily basis for the next 14 days. So he's contemplating suicide on this very evening. And he's very emotionally distraught, and he wrote this in a letter to his best friend, Max Brod. He said, "I hate them, one and all, and I think I will hardly manage to utter any words of greeting to them for the next 14 days. He uses the word hate and associates that with family. 1 represents Attila, and all represents the family. That is one reason why I named this analysis Kafka's Mirror. Not only is the Metamorphosis reflecting Kafka's life, but Attila is holding that mirror, forcing him to look at himself, and it's oftentimes the people we hold closest to us that force us to look at our flaws." Continuing in an introduction. Kafka was familiar with animal imagery such as vermin since childhood. His father oftentimes associated vermin and animal imagery with profane things. A quote that his father often mentioned to the family, from what I've read in his diary entries, is he used to say, "If you sleep with dogs, you wake up with fleas." And so, because of this, he formed this phobia of mice and vermin. And in his house, calling someone vermin was the greatest insult. So what does that tell you? That he turned into his family's greatest insult. I'm going to read to you a diary entry. And what he's doing in this excerpt is he's addressing his phobia and trying to explain to himself why he has this phobia. It says, "Of course, the fear of mice, as well as the fear of vermin, is associated with the unexpected, unsolicited, inescapable, essentially mute, and insistent appearance of these animals." So he's trying to explain to himself why he has this phobia. And look at the vocabulary he uses. So those types of words are the same types of connotation used in the novella. This is a very important piece of textual evidence. I'm going to read it to you and then go into my explanation. "As I lie in bed, I assume the form of a large beetle, a stag beetle or cockroach. I think the form of a large beetle, yes. I would then act as though it was a matter of hibernation, and I would press my little legs to my bulbous body, and I would whisper a small number of words, instructions to my sad body. You see, Kafka wrote this before the Metamorphosis was even thought of, written, or published. So my theory is that he used vermin as a coping mechanism, that when he was unwilling, unable, or didn't want to associate with his family, he would use the vermin or the image of a vermin as a coping mechanism. He wanted to lie there in his body sad and depressed, and he didn't want to associate with anyone. It says here, little legs and bulbous body, and he's affirming, yes, I am taking the form of a large beetle. So the morning after November 17th, 1912, I believe this is the image he was trying to paint for us in the Metamorphosis. If you look at this excerpt and look at the introduction of the novel, it's almost identical. He didn't want to get up in the morning. He didn't want to go work for his family. He wanted to lay there in the form of a large beetle. And I think that's a great correlation. Let's move on to part 2. So briefly, I'm going to draw parallels for you guys just to keep you on track. So specific parallels. Kafka's father aspired for his son to work for the family business, and Gregor was a young traveling businessman in the novella. Kafka experienced bouts of depression and suicidal thoughts. Gregor experienced a dramatic and physical metamorphosis. Kafka felt betrayed, rejected, and misinterpreted, and Gregor felt confined, rejected, and unloved. Similar themes there on the third bullet point. So again, I'm going to continue drawing specific parallels. My life consists, and has essentially always consisted of, attempts at writing, mostly unsuccessful. But when I did not write, I wound up on the floor, fit for a dustbin. This is an excerpt I took from a letter he wrote to his fiancée at the time, Felice. And what he's trying to explain to her is that whether or not he is writing his books, because he wrote several of them, and he feels that they are unsuccessful, or if he's experienced writing blocks, he associates himself with trash. So I looked to the Metamorphosis to find a quote similar, and this is the one I found. It says, "Dead," said Frau Samsa, which is his father, looking quizzically at the cleaning woman. "I'll say," said the cleaning woman, "and to prove it, she pushed Gregor's corpse with her broom far to the side." So what does this tell you? They're trying to prove a point here. Dead, I'll say. So it's his family reaffirming his position, that he is supposed to, they think, or Kafka portrays them to believe that he is associated with trash. And if you look at the previous slide, it says dustbin, and then on this it says pushed Gregor's corpse with her broom far to the side. So even the last part of the sentence is almost identical to the last part of the sentence in the previous slide. Another quote from the book, "We have to get rid of it," she implores her father. This is Greta speaking to her father. And she uses the word it. And this is the first time the word it is used to associate with Gregor. Every character before this uses the word he, Gregor, or Gregor's brother. She is the one that dehumanizes him, commits the death sentence. It is Greta who does this, not anyone else. And I think that this is, it's going to correlate back to Atla, because Kafka feels that she was the one that evening on November 17th, 1912, that dehumanized him. So, moving on. And like I said, Kafka uses the word choice to emphasize his sister's perception of him. Part 3. I'm going to readdress my thesis here because I know we've been talking a lot. So the second part of my thesis says, allows readers to comprehend the existentialist novel by drawing comparisons between the author and his work. So now I'm going to address existentialism. Existentialism can be hard to comprehend at times, but I hope I can simplify it for you. And the reason why it can be so hard to comprehend is because there's many different types of existentialism, and it can be very personal. So this definition: analysis of individual existence in an unfathomable universe, and the plight of the individual who must assume ultimate responsibility for the acts of free will without any certain knowledge of what is right or wrong, good or bad. So what this is trying to say is that the unfathomable universe is so big and we're so small, but despite that, we're still responsible for our acts of free will. And we shouldn't let society define what is right or wrong, good or bad, and we shouldn't let that affect our influence we have on our own free will. So basically, in essence, what this is saying is your life has no meaning until you give it meaning. And if someone else is giving it meaning, it still has no meaning because it's not your own. That's what I took from this definition, and I think that the Metamorphosis does an excellent job of portraying it. And the reason why I wanted to address existentialism is because there was a constant between Kafka's life and Gregor's life, is that they were both constantly contemplating their purpose. I saw this throughout Kafka's diaries, as he was often questioning himself. He would often form his diaries in forms of questions, and Gregor similarly too. When he was approaching death, he was contemplating his purpose. Oftentimes, when we approach our death as humans, we contemplate our purpose and what the meaning of our life was. So, again, I'm going to refer to textual evidence. "You, Gregor," cried his sister with raised fist and piercing eyes. These were the first words she had addressed directly to him since his metamorphosis. So she's physically pointing him out to himself. "You, Gregor, look what you've become, look what your purpose is." She's defining his purpose, and therefore he believes he doesn't have a purpose. And this is after the metamorphosis takes place. So she's saying, look who you've become. Your purpose is now vermin. It's tainted. That's what she's saying. But what now if all the peace, the comfort, and contentment were to come to a horrible end? And I think this can apply to everyone, and it was really irrelevant, and this was also seen in the metamorphosis. The peace, the comfort, and contentment, we experience these things throughout life, but when someone is approaching a horrible, painful death because of a sickness, or in this case, because Gregor was becoming decrepit and he was degrading, his death is coming to a horrible end, and he's questioning what his life meant and what his purpose was, again tying that back to the definition of existentialism. If it were Gregor, he would have realized long ago that it isn't possible for human beings to live with such a creature, and he would have gone away of his own free will. Again, it mentions free will, and that ties back to the definition of taking control of your own free will. And he's saying, and he would have gone away of his own free will. So he's not in control of it, someone else is. Again, tying that back to someone else is giving his life purpose. When according to existentialism, sometimes people believe that they should give their own life purpose. So now please refer to your timelines if you haven't been throughout the presentation. And you can see I've color-coded it, and it's speckled. If you look at the key, it's speckled with red and dots, and that signifies that he was experiencing romantic endeavors and failures throughout his life, and he was living at home when he was beginning to write the Metamorphosis, like I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. So what does this tell you? That the common misconception that illness was his inspiration and motive for writing the novel, that his illness confined him, is not necessarily true. Yes, he encountered ill health briefly for the first time in 1911, but he wasn't diagnosed with tuberculosis until after the book was published. So these themes, rejection, confinement, and the feeling of being unbeloved, are the themes that inspired him and drove him to write the Metamorphosis, along with the instance on November 17th. And the rejection comes from living at home and living in the confines of his own home. Feeling unbeloved and rejection comes from the failed relationships, and then embarking on those relationships again and then failing again. You have that rejection and the feeling of being unloved, and that correlates in his life and also within the novel. So my conclusion is very important, because I am a firm believer in this, in any work, not only the Metamorphosis, but for now, specifically the Metamorphosis. I hope now that you are armed with an understanding of the elements of Kafka's autobiographical writing in the Metamorphosis, because then a reader and audiences alike can more fully engage in the unique relationships that Kafka explores. Those relationships being life and literature, reality and fantasy, family and isolation. Thank you.